England, 1809. The golden light of early autumn filtered through the tall windows of Ashworth House, casting long shadows across the threadbare carpet of what had once been the Viscount Fairmont's private study. Georgiana Fairmont stood before her father's desk, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles had turned white beneath her gloves. At 24 years of age, she had learned to maintain composure in the face of disappointment, but nothing had prepared her for the words her father had just spoken. 2 weeks, she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. We have 2 weeks before the creditors seize everything. Viscount Harold Fairmont looked decades older than his 53 years. His once proud bearing had collapsed into something resembling defeat. His shoulders hunched as though carrying the weight of his failures physically upon them. The fine tailoring of his coat could not disguise the tremor in his hands as he poured himself another glass of brandy, though the morning had barely begun. The investments in the Welsh coal mines were supposed to be secure, he said, not meeting his daughter's eyes. Lord Pembroke himself assured me the returns would be substantial within 6 months. How was I to know the entire venture was built on false surveys and empty promises? Georgiana moved to the window, watching the gardeners work in the modest grounds beyond. Even they would soon be dismissed, along with most of the household staff who had served the Fairmont family for generations. The thought of Mrs. Crawford, their aging housekeeper, and Thomas, the groom who had taught Georgiana to ride as a child, losing their positions and references, filled her with a helpless fury. How much do we owe? She asked. Her father's silence was answer enough. When he finally spoke, the sum he named was staggering, far beyond anything Georgiana had imagined. Every asset they possessed, every piece of land, every heirloom, would not be sufficient to satisfy the debt. There is one solution, her father said slowly, and something in his tone made Georgiana turn from the window. Mr. Horace Beckford, the shipping merchant from Bristol, has made an offer. Georgiana felt her stomach tighten. She knew of Beckford, a man of common birth who had made his fortune through trade. He was wealthy, yes, but also known for his cruelty to his workers and his excessive habits. More significantly, he was nearly 50 years old and had buried 2 wives already. What manner of offer? She asked, though dread already whispered the answer. He has agreed to settle a portion of our debts, her father replied, in exchange for a marriage contract with Louisa. The words struck Georgiana with the force of a physical blow. Louisa, her sister, barely 16 years old, with her gentle spirit and innocent laughter. The girl who still pressed flowers in books and believed in fairy tales. The thought of that sweet child bound to a man like Beckford was unconscionable. No, Georgiana said firmly. Absolutely not. We have no choice, her father countered, finally meeting her gaze. His eyes held a desperate plea for understanding. It is either this or complete ruin. Louisa will at least be provided for, even if the match is not ideal. Not ideal? Georgiana's voice rose despite her efforts to remain calm. The man is a brute, father. There are rumors about how his previous wives died. I will not allow Louisa to be sacrificed to your poor judgment. Then what would you have me do? Her father shouted, slamming his glass down upon the desk. Watch as bailiffs tear apart our home. See your mother and sister turned out onto the streets. We are past the point of dignity, Georgiana. We are fighting for survival. The argument that followed was bitter and circular, neither yielding ground. It was only interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Mrs. Crawford entered, her lined face apologetic. Forgive the intrusion, my lord, but a messenger has arrived with an invitation. For Miss Georgiana specifically. Georgiana took the cream-coloured envelope with trembling fingers. The paper was of the finest quality, the seal bearing a crest she recognised immediately. The Duke of Winterbourne was hosting a charity ball that very evening at his London townhouse. The invitation requested her presence for a matter of potential mutual benefit. How curious, her father murmured, reading over her shoulder. I was not aware you had made the Duke's acquaintance. I have not, Georgiana replied, studying the elegant handwriting. We were introduced briefly at Lady Hartwell's musicale last season, but we exchanged no more than common pleasantries. Yet here was a personal invitation, delivered with unusual haste, suggesting something far beyond social courtesy. Georgiana felt a flutter of hope, irrational and desperate though it might be. The Duke of Winterbourne was one of the wealthiest men in England, known for his vast estates and shrewd business dealings. If he sought her out specifically, perhaps there was some opportunity she had not yet considered. "You will attend," her father said, and it was not a question. "Whatever the Duke wants, you will hear him out. We cannot afford to ignore any possibility, however remote." That evening, Georgiana stood before her, looking-glass in the finest gown she still possessed, a pale green silk that had been fashionable 3 seasons ago but remained elegant in its simplicity. Her golden hair had been arranged in a style befitting a lady of quality, though her maid's hands had shaken with the knowledge that this might be one of the last times she performed such service. "You look beautiful, miss," the girl said softly. "Whatever happens tonight, hold your head high. You are a Fairmont." The Duke of Winterbourne's London residence was magnificent, a testament to generations of accumulated wealth and power. As Georgiana's modest carriage pulled up to the entrance, she observed the flood of London's elite arriving in their finery, jewels glittering in the lamplight. She felt suddenly small and insignificant, a minor nobleman's daughter drowning in debt, pretending to belong among these people who had never known true want. The ballroom was breathtaking, crystal chandeliers casting rainbow light across marble floors and gilded walls. An orchestra played in one corner, while servants circulated with champagne and delicacies. Georgiana accepted a glass simply to have something to hold, her eyes scanning the crowd for her mysterious host. She did not have long to wait. "Miss Fairmont." The voice was deep and cultured, carrying an authority that made nearby conversations falter. "I am pleased you accepted my invitation." Georgiana turned to face Philip Grayson, Duke of Winterbourne, and felt her breath catch despite herself. He was tall, perhaps 6 feet, with dark chestnut hair and eyes of such a pale, icy blue, they seemed almost unnatural in their intensity. His features were aristocratic and severe, the face of a man who had never needed to smile to command attention. He wore his formal evening attire with the ease of one born to it, every detail perfect, every movement controlled. "Your Grace," she curtsied appropriately. "Your invitation was most intriguing." "Direct and honest," he observed, the faintest suggestion of approval in his tone. "I appreciate that quality, Miss Fairmont. Shall we speak somewhere more private? I have a proposition that requires discretion." He offered his arm, and Georgiana took it, acutely aware of the curious glances following them as the Duke led her from the ballroom to a smaller sitting room down a quiet corridor. Once inside, he closed the door, but left it slightly ajar, maintaining propriety while ensuring privacy. "I will be equally direct, Miss Fairmont," he began without preamble. "I am aware of your family's financial difficulties. I know that your father owes considerable sums to several creditors, and that a Mr. Horace Beckford has made an offer regarding your younger sister." Georgiana felt heat rise to her cheeks, shame and anger warring within her. "I was not aware our private misfortunes had become public knowledge." "They have not, generally speaking," the Duke replied. "But I make it my business to be well informed about matters that may affect my interests. Your situation, Miss Fairmont, presents an opportunity for both of us. I cannot imagine what interest our ruin could possibly hold for a man of your position, Your Grace." Philip Grayson moved to the fireplace, his profile sharp in the flickering light. "I require a wife, Miss Fairmont. Not permanently, but for a specific purpose and duration. My late mother's will stipulates that I must be married before my 33rd birthday in order to inherit her considerable fortune, separate from my father's estate. That birthday falls in 8 months' time." Georgiana stared at him, certain she had misheard. "Surely you could have your choice of any lady in England, Your Grace." "Why approach me with such an unusual arrangement?" "Because most ladies would expect this marriage to be permanent," he replied, turning to face her directly. "They would expect affection, heirs, the full substance of matrimony. You, Miss Fairmont, are in a position to understand the practical nature of what I am offering. A business transaction, nothing more." "What exactly are you proposing?" Georgiana asked, though her heart already pounded with terrible hope. "Become my wife for 1 year," the Duke said simply. Present yourself to society as the Duchess of Winterbourne. Fulfill the basic requirements of the role. And once I have secured my inheritance, we will come to an understanding about the future of our arrangement. In exchange, I will pay your father's debts in their entirety and provide a generous dowry for your sister, freeing her from this unfortunate engagement to Mr. Beckford. The room seemed to tilt around Georgiana. It was salvation, handed to her on a silver platter by one of the most powerful men in England. Yet every instinct screamed that there must be more to this than he was revealing. "Why me?" she pressed. "Truly, Your Grace, there must be dozens of women who would accept such terms gladly." Something flickered in those ice-blue eyes, gone too quickly to identify. "You are of appropriate rank, but not so elevated as to have significant family interference. You are of age and unmarried, with no pending attachments that I am aware of. And most importantly, Miss Fairmont, you are desperate enough to accept terms that others might find objectionable, yet intelligent enough to fulfill the role convincingly." It was brutally honest, almost insulting in its assessment. Yet Georgiana could not fault the logic. She was indeed desperate. The image of Louisa's frightened face, as her father had explained the arrangement with Beckford, rose unbidden in her mind. "What are the specific terms?" she asked, proud that her voice remained steady. The Duke withdrew a folded document from his coat. "A marriage contract. You will reside at my principal estate in Devonshire and perform the duties expected of a duchess in social situations as required. In return, your family's debts will be settled, your sister's dowry secured, and you will receive a personal allowance befitting your position. After 1 year, we will reassess the arrangement." Georgiana took the contract with hands that trembled only slightly. The legal language was dense, the terms numerous. She began to read carefully, but the Duke interrupted. "Time is a factor, Miss Fairmont. Your father's creditors move quickly, and Mr. Beckford expects an answer by week's end. I can have the ceremony arranged within 3 days if you agree tonight." 3 days. Barely time to comprehend what she would be committing to, let alone review this contract thoroughly. Yet what choice did she have? Louisa's future, her family's survival, all hung in the balance. "You promise the arrangement will be temporary?" she asked, searching his face for some hint of deception. "After 1 year, I will be free." "You have my word as a gentleman," the Duke replied. It should have been enough. A duke's word was supposed to be sacred, inviolable. Yet something in his careful phrasing, in the way he did not quite meet her eyes as he said it, sent a whisper of warning through Georgiana's mind. But the alternative was Louisa, married to a monster, her family disgraced and destitute. "I accept," Georgiana said, before she could think better of it. "I will be your Duchess, Your Grace." She took the offered pen and signed her name at the bottom of the contract, barely scanning the pages above. It was only later, much later, that she would realize what she had truly agreed to. The journey from London to Devonshire took 3 days, each mile carrying Georgiana further from everything familiar into a future she could scarcely comprehend. The wedding had been conducted with swift efficiency at a small chapel in London, witnessed only by the Duke's solicitor and a clerk pulled from the street. There had been no flowers, no celebration, no kiss to seal the vows. Philip had signed the register, offered his arm for the brief walk back to the carriage, and then retreated into silence so complete it felt almost hostile. Now, as the Duke's elegant travelling coach crested the final hill revealing Winterbourne Hall below, Georgiana understood for the first time the true magnitude of what she had agreed to. The estate stretched across the valley like a small kingdom unto itself, the main house a magnificent Georgian structure of honey-coloured stone, with 2 symmetrical wings extending from a central block crowned with classical pediments. Formal gardens surrounded the residence in geometric precision, while beyond them she could see tenant farms, woodland, and pastures dotting the landscape for what appeared to be miles in every direction. "It is beautiful," she said quietly, breaking the silence that had persisted since their last stop. Philip glanced up from the papers he had been reviewing throughout the journey. "It has been in my family for 6 generations, he replied, his tone suggesting he was merely stating a fact rather than expressing any particular pride. The main house was completed in 1768, though portions of the original Tudor structure remain in the east wing. "And this is where I am to live?" Georgiana asked, though the answer was obvious. "Where we are to live," he corrected, returning his attention to his documents. "You will find your chambers prepared in the west wing. The household staff has been informed of your arrival and will attend to your needs." The carriage rolled to a stop before the imposing entrance, where what appeared to be the entire household staff had assembled in two neat lines. Georgiana counted at least 30 people, from the distinguished elderly man, who must be the butler, to a tiny maid who could not have been more than 12 years old. All stood at rigid attention, their expressions carefully neutral as they waited to greet their new mistress. Philip descended first and offered his hand to assist Georgiana. As her feet touched the gravel drive, she was acutely conscious of all those eyes upon her, judging, assessing, wondering what manner of woman had captured their famously aloof master. "May I present Her Grace, the Duchess of Winterbourne," Philip announced to the assembled staff, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "You will extend to her every courtesy and obedience that her position demands." The elderly butler stepped forward and bowed deeply. "Your Grace, I am Harrington. I have served the Grayson family for 43 years, and it is my honour to welcome you to Winterbourne Hall. If there is anything you require, you have only to ask." "Thank you, Harrington," Georgiana replied, summoning every ounce of composure she possessed. "I look forward to learning the ways of the household." One by one, the staff was introduced. The housekeeper, Mrs. Prescott, a stern-faced woman with iron-grey hair and sharp eyes. The cook, Mrs. Dalton, whose generous figure spoke well of her culinary skills. The head gardener, Mr. Fletcher, the stablemaster, young William, and on through footmen, maids, and various other servants whose names and positions blurred together in Georgiana's exhausted mind. When the introductions concluded, Philip turned to her with that same cool formality. "Mrs. Prescott will show you to your rooms. I have business matters requiring my attention. We will dine at 8 this evening." He strode into the house without waiting for her response, leaving Georgiana standing alone before the assembled staff. She felt suddenly like an imposter, a girl playing dress-up in a role far beyond her abilities. But she was a Fairmont, and Fairmonts did not crumble under scrutiny. "Mrs. Prescott," she said, squaring her shoulders, "I would be grateful if you would show me to my chambers." The west wing proved to be a suite of rooms more luxurious than anything Georgiana had experienced in her father's modest home. A sitting room decorated in soft blues and creams opened into a spacious bedchamber dominated by a carved mahogany bed hung with silk curtains. Beyond lay a dressing room lined with wardrobes and a modern bathing chamber with copper fixtures that gleamed in the afternoon light. "His Grace had the rooms redecorated in anticipation of your arrival," Mrs. Prescott explained, her tone carefully neutral. "If the colours do not suit, adjustments can be made." "They are lovely," Georgiana assured her, running her fingers over the silk upholstery of a chair near the window. "I could not ask for finer accommodations." Mrs. Prescott's expression softened fractionally. "Your trunks will arrive tomorrow with the second coach. Until then, we have prepared basic necessities. Jane will serve as your lady's maid. She is young, but capable." A fair-haired girl of perhaps 18 stepped forward and curtsied. "Your Grace, it will be my honour to serve you." "Thank you, Jane," Georgiana replied warmly. "I am certain we shall get along well." After Mrs. Prescott departed, leaving Jane to help Georgiana freshen from the journey, Georgiana moved to the window overlooking the gardens. From this vantage point, she could see the careful design of the landscaping, the play of fountains, the distant gleam of what might be a lake. It was breathtaking and utterly alien. "Jane," she said quietly, "how long have you worked at Winterbourne?" 3 years, Your Grace," the girl replied as she laid out fresh linens. "Since I was 15. My mother is Mrs. Dalton, the cook. And the Duke, what manner of employer is he?" Jane hesitated, clearly torn between honesty and propriety. "His Grace is fair," she said finally. "He expects excellence but rewards loyal service. He is not given to warmth, but neither is he cruel." It was a diplomatic answer that revealed more than the girl perhaps intended. Philip Grayson was a man who inspired respect rather than affection, duty rather than devotion. That evening, Georgiana dressed for dinner in the finest of the limited garments she had brought with her. The dining room proved to be another exercise in intimidation, a vast chamber with a table capable of seating 30, though only 2 places had been set at one end. Crystal gleamed under the light of 3 chandeliers, and portraits of stern-faced ancestors gazed down from the walls. Philip was already seated when she entered, dressed in evening attire that emphasized his aristocratic bearing. He rose briefly as she approached, a concession to courtesy that somehow felt more perfunctory than respectful. "I trust your rooms are satisfactory," he said as footmen served the first course. "Very much so," Georgiana replied. "You have a beautiful home, Your Grace." "Philip," he corrected. "We are married after all. It would seem odd for my wife to address me with such formality in private. Then you must call me Georgiana." He inclined his head in acknowledgement, but did not repeat her name, as though even this small intimacy was too much to grant. They ate in near silence, the only sounds the clink of silver against porcelain and the soft footsteps of servants bringing and clearing courses. Georgiana searched desperately for some topic of conversation, some way to bridge the vast distance between them. But everything that came to mind seemed either too personal or too trivial. It was only as dessert was being served that Philip spoke again. "You will receive callers beginning next week. The neighbouring gentry will wish to meet the new Duchess. You will, of course, accept their visits and return them as appropriate." "Of course," Georgiana agreed. "Are there particular families I should be aware of?" "Mrs. Prescott will provide you with the necessary information," he replied dismissively. "She has managed such matters efficiently in my mother's absence." The mention of his mother was the first personal detail he had offered. "How long has she been gone?" Georgiana asked gently. 14 years, Philip said, his expression hardening. "She died when I was 18. Before Georgiana could express sympathy or ask anything further, he rose from the table. "If you will excuse me, I have correspondence to attend to. Good night, Georgiana." She sat alone in that enormous dining room, surrounded by the remnants of an elaborate meal and the watching eyes of painted ancestors, and felt the true weight of her bargain settle upon her shoulders. The following days fell into a pattern that was both busy and oddly lonely. Georgiana met with Mrs. Prescott each morning to discuss household matters, learning the complex machinery that kept Winterbourne Hall running smoothly. She discovered that she was responsible for approving menus, managing household accounts, overseeing the activities of the female servants, and maintaining the social calendar. It was far more than she had anticipated, closer to managing a small business than simply being a wife. Philip remained distant, taking his breakfast before she rose and often dining in his study rather than joining her. When they did encounter one another, he was unfailingly polite but utterly impersonal, treating her more like a competent employee than a spouse. It was on the 4th day after their arrival that a packet of letters arrived from London. Georgiana's hands trembled as she broke the seal on the one bearing her father's familiar handwriting. "My dearest Georgiana," it began. "Words cannot express our gratitude for the sacrifice you have made on our behalf. The Duke has been true to his word. All our debts have been settled, and we are no longer in danger of losing Ashworth House. More importantly, the arrangement with Mr. Beckford has been dissolved. The man accepted a financial settlement in lieu of the marriage contract, though his displeasure was evident. Your sister is free, Georgiana, and it is entirely due to your courage." Tears blurred the words as Georgiana read on. Louisa had written a separate letter, full of relief and gratitude and innocent chatter about a small assembly she had attended, where she met a young man, Mr. Thomas Whitmore, who was training as a solicitor. The girl's happiness shone through every line, and Georgiana found her own sacrifice suddenly bearable. This was why she had agreed. This was what made the cold formality of her marriage worthwhile. But it was later that same day, while Jane was helping her dress for another solitary dinner, that Georgiana decided to review the marriage contract more thoroughly. She had signed it in haste, trusting Philip's verbal assurance that the arrangement was temporary. Now, with the reality of her situation settling in, she felt compelled to understand exactly what she had agreed to. She retrieved the folded document from her writing desk and began to read carefully. working through the dense legal language with growing unease. The contract specified her duties as Duchess, the financial arrangements, the management of the household. But as she reached the final pages, searching for the clause that would dissolve the marriage after 1 year, her blood ran cold. There was no such clause. Nothing about dissolution, separation, or the temporary nature of their union. The only mention of duration was a standard phrase, "for all the days of their natural lives, as ordained by God and the laws of England." Georgiana read it again, certain she must have missed something. But no matter how many times her eyes scanned the pages, the truth remained unchanged. Philip had promised her verbally that this would be temporary, but the legal document she had signed bound her to him permanently. She was not a duchess for a year, she was a duchess forever. The realization sent panic coursing through her veins. She had been deceived, tricked into signing away her entire future, while believing she was making a limited sacrifice. The man she had married was not honorable at all. He was a manipulator who had exploited her desperation. Georgiana waited until after dinner that evening, then sent word through Harrington that she required an audience with His Grace in his study. When she entered the book-lined room where Philip sat reviewing documents by lamplight, she held the contract before her like a weapon. "You lied to me," she said without preamble, her voice shaking with fury. Philip looked up, his expression unchanging. "I beg your pardon." "This contract," Georgiana thrust it toward him. "You promised me this marriage would last 1 year. You gave me your word as a gentleman. But there is no provision for dissolution anywhere in these pages." He set down his pen with deliberate care. "I believe I said we would reassess the arrangement after 1 year. I never specified that it would end." "That is sophistry, and you know it," Georgiana shot back, her anger overriding her caution. "You deliberately misled me to secure my agreement." "I secured an agreement that was mutually beneficial," Philip replied coolly. "Your family's debts are paid. Your sister is free. These results would not change regardless of the contract's specific terms." "But my freedom would," Georgiana said, hearing her voice crack despite her efforts to remain composed. "I thought I was trading 1 year for their salvation. Instead, I have traded my entire life." Philip rose and moved to the window, his profile sharp against the darkened glass. "Perhaps you should have read the contract more thoroughly before signing." The casual cruelty of his words struck her like a physical blow. "How dare you?" she whispered. "How dare you take advantage of my desperation? What manner of man manipulates a woman in such straits?" He turned to face her, and for a moment something flickered in those ice-blue eyes. Guilt, regret. It was gone too quickly to identify. "The manner of man who requires a wife and knows that women with more options would never agree to the terms I need." "What terms?" Georgiana demanded. "Why go to such lengths to trap someone into marriage? You could have your choice of any lady in England." "Could I?" A bitter smile twisted his lips. "You know nothing of my circumstances, Georgiana. Nothing of why this arrangement was necessary." "Then enlighten me," she challenged. "If I am to be bound to you for life, I deserve to know why." For a long moment, Philip said nothing. Then he moved to a locked drawer in his desk, withdrew a key from his waistcoat, and retrieved a document. "This is my mother's will." Read the relevant section. Georgiana took the papers and scanned until she found the clause he indicated. Her eyes widened as she absorbed the full implications. She required that you be married before receiving your inheritance, but also that you remain married for a minimum of 5 years, or the funds revert to distant cousins. "Precisely," Philip confirmed. 1 year would have been insufficient. I needed a wife who would fulfill the obligation for its full duration without the complications that genuine affection might bring. "So you found someone desperate enough to agree under false pretenses," Georgiana said flatly. "I found someone in a position to understand necessity," he corrected. "Make no mistake, Georgiana. I have fulfilled my part of our bargain. Your family is saved. You live in comfort and luxury. What you do with those circumstances is your affair. But you will remain the Duchess of Winterbourne." The finality in his voice made clear that further argument was useless. Georgiana turned to leave, then paused at the door. You may have secured my presence, Your Grace, but you will never secure my loyalty. I will perform the duties required of me, but do not mistake compliance for contentment. I expect nothing more, Philip replied, already returning to his paperwork. Georgiana fled to her chambers, where she dismissed Jane and gave in to the tears that had been threatening since she discovered the truth. She had saved her family, but at what cost to herself? She was trapped in a marriage of convenience that would never be anything more, bound to a man who saw her as a means to an end, rather than a person deserving of honesty or respect. A soft knock at her door interrupted her despair. "Enter," she called, hastily wiping her eyes. A woman swept into the room without waiting for further invitation. She was perhaps 35, tall and elegant, in an emerald gown that set off her auburn hair and sharp green eyes. Everything about her, from her confident bearing to the slight curl of her lips, suggested someone accustomed to authority. "So you are the new Duchess," the woman said, her tone making it clear this was not a compliment. "How quaint. I am Lady Constance Marlowe, Philip's cousin. I have been managing Winterbourne Hall in the absence of a proper mistress for the past 3 years. Georgiana rose, drawing on reserves of dignity she did not know she possessed. "Lady Constance, I was not aware we were expecting guests." "I am hardly a guest," Constance replied, circling the room as though inspecting it. "This is practically my home. I was rather surprised when Philip informed me he had taken a wife, and such a hasty marriage too. One cannot help but wonder what circumstances necessitated such haste." The insinuation was clear and deeply insulting. "The circumstances of my marriage are between my husband and myself," Georgiana said coldly. Constance laughed, a brittle sound without warmth. "Oh, my dear, do not pretend this was a love match. Philip does not possess the capacity for such sentiment. Whatever arrangement you have made, I suggest you not grow too comfortable in your role. These situations have a way of resolving themselves, and when they do, Winterbourne Hall will return to those who truly understand it." "I am the Duchess of Winterbourne," Georgiana replied, her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her stomach. "That is not a role I intend to relinquish." Constance's smile sharpened. "We shall see, my dear. We shall see." After the woman departed, Georgiana sank into a chair, her entire body trembling. She had thought herself prepared for the challenges of this marriage, but she had not anticipated the depth of Philip's deception, or the hostility she would face from his family. She was alone in a house that did not want her, bound to a man who had manipulated her, surrounded by people who saw her as an interloper. But she was also a woman who had sacrificed everything to save those she loved. And she would not be defeated. Not by Philip's coldness, not by Constance's malice, not by any of the obstacles that stood before her. If she was to be the Duchess of Winterbourne, then she would be a duchess worthy of the title, regardless of the circumstances that had brought her here. The battle for her place had begun, and Georgiana Fairmont Grayson intended to win. The weeks following Lady Constance's unwelcome arrival settled into a pattern that Georgiana refused to accept as permanent. If she was to be trapped at Winterbourne Hall, bound by a contract she had signed in desperation, then she would not waste her days in passive misery. She was the Duchess of Winterbourne, and she intended to make that role mean something beyond mere title. Her first act of rebellion was subtle. During her daily meetings with Mrs. Prescott, Georgiana began asking questions that went beyond the superficial. Not just what was being purchased for the household, but why, at what cost, and from which suppliers. The housekeeper, initially surprised by such detailed interest, gradually warmed to a mistress who actually cared about the mechanisms of estate management. "The wine merchant charges how much per cask?" Georgiana asked one morning, reviewing the household ledgers that Mrs. Prescott had reluctantly provided. £12, Your Grace," the housekeeper replied. "It has been the standard rate for the past 5 years. And we purchase 6 casks per quarter." Georgiana's finger traced down the column of figures. "That is £72 annually for wine alone, not including spirits or champagne." Mrs. Prescott shifted uncomfortably. "His Grace entertains frequently when in residence, and Lady Constance has been quite generous in her hospitality on his behalf." Georgiana made a note in the margin. Over the following days, she discovered similar patterns throughout the household accounts. The candle supplier charged premium rates despite providing inferior product. The butcher's bills seemed inflated compared to market prices she had known in London. The dressmaker who had been commissioned to create a wardrobe for the new Duchess quoted sums that would have funded an entire season's worth of gowns elsewhere. When she raised these concerns with Mrs. Prescott, the housekeeper's expression became guarded. "Lady Constance has managed these arrangements for 3 years, Your Grace. I am certain she secured the best terms available." "Then Lady Constance was either incompetent or dishonest," Georgiana replied calmly. "I shall be renegotiating these contracts personally." Word of the new Duchess's interference reached Lady Constance within hours. She swept into Georgiana's sitting room without knocking, her face flushed with indignation. "How dare you question my management of this household?" Constance hissed, her green eyes flashing with fury. "I have maintained Winterbourne Hall to the highest standards in Philip's mother's absence." "The highest standards would not include paying £12 for wine we could obtain for 8, Georgiana replied, without looking up from the ledger before her. "Nor would they involve purchasing inferior candles at premium prices, simply because the supplier is your friend's cousin." Constance's flush deepened. "You presume much for a woman who signed a marriage contract without even reading it properly. We all know the truth of your situation, Georgiana. You are here on sufferance, not by right." "I am here as Philip's wife, legally bound and properly married," Georgiana corrected, finally meeting the other woman's gaze. "My position is unassailable, regardless of the circumstances that brought me here. Yours, however, is entirely dependent upon my tolerance." "Einzel." "We shall see how long that lasts," Constance said coldly. "Philip may have married you out of necessity, but he trusts me. We have been companions since childhood. I know him in ways you never will." After Constance departed, leaving a wake of barely suppressed rage, Georgiana felt her hands trembling. She had made an enemy, that much was certain. But she had also established boundaries, claimed territory that was rightfully hers as mistress of the household. Over the following weeks, Georgiana systematically reviewed every aspect of Winterbourne's operations. She met with the stable master and discovered that the feed supplier was charging rates well above market value. She toured the gardens with Mr. Fletcher and learned that the previous year's landscaping project had cost nearly double what it should have. Everywhere she looked, she found evidence of waste, inefficiency, and what increasingly appeared to be deliberate mismanagement. The savings she implemented were substantial. By renegotiating contracts, eliminating unnecessary expenditures, and bringing proper oversight to household purchases, Georgiana reduced monthly operating costs by nearly 30%. She kept meticulous records, documenting every change and its financial impact. Philip noticed, of course. It would have been impossible for him not to, given that his personal secretary brought him monthly accounting summaries. But he said nothing directly to Georgiana, acknowledging her efforts only through a brief note delivered by Harrington. The recent improvements to household efficiency are noted and appreciated. It was hardly effusive praise, but coming from a man who spoke to her only when absolutely necessary, Georgiana took it as a small victory. Lady Constance's response was less measured. Finding her influence systematically dismantled, she turned to more subtle forms of warfare. Whispers began to circulate among the neighbouring gentry, carefully planted suggestions about the new Duchess's questionable origins and the suspicious haste of her marriage to the Duke. "I heard her father was practically destitute," Lady Pemberton remarked to her companion at a garden party hosted by the local squire's wife. "Sold his daughter to the highest bidder to escape debtor's prison." "And the Duke, such a tragic figure," another lady added with false sympathy. "Forced to marry out of necessity when his heart clearly belongs elsewhere." The rumours reached Georgiana through Jane, who heard them from the other servants at the gathering. "They say terrible things, Your Grace," the girl reported, her young face troubled. "About how you trapped His Grace into marriage." Georgiana absorbed this information with outward calm, though inwardly she seethed. She knew precisely who was spreading these tales. Constance might have left Winterbourne Hall, but her poison lingered. Yet what Georgiana did not know was that Lady Constance's machinations extended beyond mere gossip. In her bitterness at being displaced, Constance had begun corresponding with Lord Edmund Hartley, Philip's distant cousin, and a man with his own grievances against the Duke. The letters were carefully worded. full of innocent family news, but they contained enough details about Philip's sudden marriage and the circumstances surrounding it to pique Edmund's considerable interest. The test of Georgiana's position came in early October when Philip announced they would be hosting a reception for the local gentry. It would be Georgiana's formal introduction to Devonshire society as the Duchess of Winterbourne, and everyone from the neighbouring estates would attend, curious to assess the woman who had captured England's most elusive bachelor. "You will, of course, conduct yourself appropriately," Philip instructed during one of their rare private conversations. "First impressions are critical in these matters. I am aware of what is expected," Georgiana replied coolly. "I may have been forced into this marriage through deception, but I am still the daughter of a viscount. I know how to conduct myself in society." Something flickered in Philip's expression at her sharp tone, but he merely nodded. "Mrs. Prescott will assist with the arrangements. The guest list is already prepared." The night of the reception, Georgiana dressed with unusual care in a gown of deep sapphire silk that Jane had helped select from the new wardrobe Philip had commissioned. The colour brought out the green of her eyes and complemented her fair complexion. She wore the Grayson sapphires, a magnificent necklace and earring set that Philip's mother had worn, delivered to her chambers that afternoon with a note in Philip's hand. "These belong to the Duchess of Winterbourne. Wear them tonight." As guests began arriving, Georgiana took her place beside Philip at the entrance to the Grand Salon, greeting each arrival with practiced grace. She felt their appraising gazes, heard the unspoken questions in their polite compliments. Who was this woman? Why had the Duke married so suddenly? What did she offer that London's finest had not? Lady Pemberton was among the first to arrive, her sharp eyes assessing every detail of Georgiana's appearance and finding it, apparently, satisfactory enough for a tight smile. "Your Grace, how lovely you look. That gown is exquisite." "Thank you, Lady Pemberton," Georgiana replied warmly. "I understand you have a beautiful rose garden. I should very much like to visit it, if you would permit." The genuine interest in her voice seemed to surprise the older woman. "Of course, Your Grace. You would be most welcome." One by one, Georgiana charmed or at least neutralized the assembled company. She asked intelligent questions about local matters, demonstrated knowledge of estate management that impressed the gentlemen, and showed proper deference to those of greater age while maintaining the dignity expected of a duchess. When Mrs. Hartwell, the vicar's wife, mentioned the struggling village school, Georgiana immediately expressed interest in supporting its expansion, referencing the improvements Philip's mother had initiated years earlier. "You have studied the late Duchess's charitable works," Mrs. Hartwell observed with approval. She would be pleased to know they continue. From across the room, Philip watched his wife navigate the social complexities with unexpected skill. She was not the most beautiful woman present, nor the most fashionably dressed, but there was something compelling about her composure, her intelligence, her genuine interest in those around her. He found himself listening to her conversations, noting how she deflected intrusive questions with grace and redirected attention away from the circumstances of their marriage toward more neutral topics. When Lady Pemberton attempted to probe into the speed of their courtship, Georgiana smiled serenely and replied, "Sometimes one simply knows when a match is right. Would you not agree? My parents had an equally brief engagement, and they enjoyed 40 happy years together before my mother's passing." It was a masterly deflection, invoking sentiment while revealing nothing of substance. Philip felt an unfamiliar stirring of respect. The evening progressed smoothly, until Lady Constance's name arose in conversation. One of the guests, apparently unaware of the tension, remarked, "Such a pity Lady Constance could not attend. She has always been such a gracious presence at Winterbourne gatherings." "Lady Constance has her own estates to manage," Georgiana replied smoothly. "I am certain she is much occupied with her responsibilities there." "Still, it must be difficult," the guest persisted with unfortunate insensitivity, "to fill the shoes of someone who has been so integral to Winterbourne for so long." "I am not attempting to fill anyone's shoes," Georgiana said, her voice pleasantly firm. "I am forging my own path as Duchess, with different strengths and different approaches. Comparison serves no useful purpose." The subtle rebuke was delivered so graciously that the guest could only nod and retreat. But the message was clear to all who heard. Georgiana would not be diminished by references to her predecessor in the role. Later, as the last guests departed and the servants began clearing the salon, Philip found Georgiana standing alone by the windows, her shoulders betraying a weariness her face had not shown all evening. "You managed that well," he said quietly. She turned, surprise evident in her expression. "Thank you. I trust the reception met your expectations." "It exceeded them," Philip admitted. "You have a gift for managing people, for making them feel heard while revealing nothing you do not wish known. A necessary skill when one's position is built on secrets," Georgiana replied, a note of bitterness creeping into her voice. Philip was silent for a moment. "I notice the changes you have made to the household operations. The cost reductions are significant." "Lady Constance was either incompetent or corrupt," Georgiana said bluntly. "I suspect the latter, given that several of the suppliers she favoured have family connections to her." "You should have brought this to my attention." "Why?" Georgiana met his gaze directly. "So you could dismiss my concerns as the complaints of a meddling wife. I prefer to demonstrate competence through results rather than request permission to do the job I am already obligated to perform." Something shifted in Philip's expression. A crack in the ice that usually armoured his features. "You judge me harshly." "I judge you accurately," Georgiana countered. "You manipulated me into a marriage you knew I believed to be temporary. You have barely spoken to me in the weeks since we arrived here. You treat me as a competent employee rather than a wife. Harsh judgment requires harsh behaviour to inspire it. You do not know the full circumstances," Philip said, his voice low. "Then perhaps you should enlighten me," Georgiana challenged. "If we are to be bound together for years, surely I deserve more than coldness and silence." For a long moment, Philip simply looked at her, an internal struggle visible in his eyes. Then he moved to the sideboard and poured himself a generous glass of brandy, draining half of it before speaking. "5 years ago," he began slowly, "I was engaged to be married. Lady Catherine Hartley, daughter of the Earl of Westbrook. Beautiful, accomplished, from an impeccable family. Everything society deemed appropriate for a duchess." Georgiana remained silent, sensing that any interruption would shatter this unexpected moment of revelation. "The wedding was to be the event of the season," Philip continued, pouring another glass. 500 guests, St. George's in London, every detail perfect. I was young enough then to believe in romantic ideals, fool that I was. I thought I loved her. I certainly believed she loved me." He drank again, the brandy loosening words that had clearly been locked away for years. "The morning of the wedding I received a letter. Catherine had eloped the night before with my cousin, Lord Edmund Hartley. She wrote that she had realised she could not marry a man as cold and unfeeling as I, that Edmund offered the passion and warmth I was incapable of providing." "Philip," Georgiana breathed, genuine sympathy flooding through her despite their complicated circumstances. "The guests were already arriving at the church," he said flatly. "I had to stand before 500 people and announce that there would be no wedding, that my bride had chosen another man. The scandal was tremendous, the humiliation complete." He turned to face her, his expression raw in a way she had never seen. "So you see, Georgiana, I learned then what trusting in promises and romantic sentiment earns a man. Betrayal, public shame, the destruction of every foolish hope one might have harboured." "Not every person is capable of such cruelty," Georgiana said gently. "No," Philip agreed. "But how does one distinguish the trustworthy from the treacherous until it is too late? The contract you signed may have been born of my need for an heir and my mother's stipulations, but its true purpose was to ensure I would never again be abandoned. I required a wife who could not leave, who was bound by law and necessity rather than affection that might fade or transform into betrayal." Georgiana understood then, truly understood, the man before her. He was not cruel by nature, but wounded, building walls so high that no one could reach him to cause further harm. His manipulation of her had been wrong, but it had been born of fear rather than malice. "I am sorry," she said quietly, "for what Catherine did to you, for the pain it caused. But Philip, trapping me in marriage to protect yourself from future hurt is not the answer. It only ensures that we are both prisoners here. Perhaps, he acknowledged, finishing his brandy. But it is the prison I chose, and I will not apologize for that choice. He left her then, retreating to his study as he did every night. But something had shifted between them, a first crack in the walls they had built around themselves. It was not forgiveness, not yet trust, but it was understanding. And understanding, Georgiana thought as she made her way to her chambers, was at least a beginning. That night, as Jane helped her undress, Georgiana's thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of a letter, delivered by one of the footmen with apologies for the late hour. She recognized Louisa's handwriting immediately and broke the seal eagerly. The letter was full of her sister's characteristic enthusiasm, thanks for Georgiana's sacrifice, and news of the family's much improved circumstances. But it was the final paragraph that made Georgiana smile, despite everything. I must tell you of the most wonderful occurrence, dearest sister. At Mrs. Pemberton's assembly last week, I was introduced to Mr. Thomas Whitmore, a young solicitor establishing his practice in our village. He is intelligent, kind, and we spent the entire evening in conversation about books and ideas. I know it is foolish to hope after only one meeting, but I find myself thinking of him constantly. For the first time, I understand what it means to wish for someone's company above all others. I pray I might see him again soon. Georgiana folded the letter carefully, her heart swelling with gratitude. Whatever her own situation, Louisa was free to find love, to make her own choices, to build a future unburdened by debt or desperation. That alone made Georgiana's sacrifice worthwhile. As she lay in her bed that night, staring at the canopy above, Georgiana reflected on all that had changed in so short a time. She had come to Winterbourne as a prisoner, trapped by circumstance and deception. But she was building something here, carving out a role that mattered, proving her worth through competence and intelligence. And Philip, despite his coldness, had revealed a vulnerability that made him seem less monster and more wounded man. She did not love him. Not yet, perhaps, not ever. But she understood him better now. And understanding was the foundation upon which everything else might eventually be built. If they were to be bound together, then they would be bound as partners, not as jailer and captive. The battle for Winterbourne Hall was far from over, but Georgiana had won several important victories. She had proven herself capable, earned the respect of the local society, and glimpsed the human heart beating beneath Philip's icy exterior. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, she knew. Lady Constance's machinations had not ended, and the secret correspondence with Lord Edmund Hartley would eventually bear poisonous fruit. But tonight, Georgiana Fairmont Grayson, Duchess of Winterbourne, slept with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had found her footing in uncertain terrain and refused to be defeated by circumstances beyond her control. The autumn rains came early that year, confining the household to indoor pursuits for days at a time. It was during one such grey afternoon, as Georgiana sat in the library reviewing estate correspondence, that Philip entered seeking a volume on agricultural improvements. He paused upon seeing her, as though debating whether to retreat to his study, then moved forward with visible resolve. "I did not mean to disturb you," he said, his tone less formal than usual. "You are not disturbing me," Georgiana replied, setting aside her papers. "This is your library, after all. I am merely borrowing it." "It is our library," Philip corrected, moving to the shelves. "Everything at Winterbourne belongs equally to the Duchess." It was a small concession, but coming from him, it felt significant. He located the volume he sought, then hesitated, rather than departing immediately. "What are you reading?" he asked, gesturing to the leather-bound book beside her. "Repton's Theories on Landscape Design," Georgiana answered. "Mr. Fletcher mentioned that the East Gardens need redesigning, and I thought to educate myself before making suggestions." Philip's eyebrows rose. "You are taking an interest in the grounds as well as the household accounts? Is that surprising? A well-designed landscape enhances both the beauty and value of an estate. Besides," she added with a slight smile, I find Repton's arguments about natural beauty versus formal symmetry quite compelling. You favor the natural approach? Philip asked, and there was genuine curiosity in his voice. I believe there is merit in both, Georgiana replied thoughtfully. Formal gardens near the house provide structure and elegance appropriate to the architecture. But beyond that, allowing the landscape to follow its natural contours creates a sense of harmony that rigid geometry cannot achieve. Philip moved closer, examining the diagrams in her book. My mother held similar views. She began redesigning portions of the Eastern approach before she died, but the work was never completed. I would be honored to continue her vision, Georgiana said softly, if you would permit it. For a moment, Philip simply looked at her, something unreadable in his expression. Then he gestured to the architectural folios on a nearby shelf. Those contain my mother's original plans. You may find them useful. Over the following weeks, what began as a single conversation about gardens evolved into something more. Philip began seeking Georgiana's company deliberately, first discussing estate matters, then gradually expanding into other topics. They discovered a shared appreciation for Gothic architecture, debated the merits of various poets, and found themselves spending evenings in the library, engaged in conversations that lasted long past the hour, when Philip typically retreated to his study. Georgiana felt something dangerous stirring within her, an unwelcome warmth when Philip entered a room, a quickening of her pulse when his hand accidentally brushed hers while reaching for the same book. She was developing feelings for the man who had trapped her in marriage, and the realization terrified her. This was not part of their arrangement. Affection would only complicate what was already an impossible situation, yet she could not seem to prevent it. When Philip smiled, truly smiled, at something she said, Georgiana felt a rush of pleasure she had not experienced since girlhood. When he sought her opinion on estate matters, treating her as an intellectual equal rather than a subordinate, she felt valued in ways she had never known. It was foolish, dangerous, and entirely beyond her control. One morning in late October, Philip proposed they visit the village of Thornbury, the small settlement that served Winterbourne's tenant farmers and staff. The harvest festival is this weekend, he explained. As Duke and Duchess, we should make an appearance. It is expected. The village proved charming, a collection of stone cottages clustered around a small green where preparations for the festival were already underway. Children ran between the stalls being erected, while women arranged displays of preserves and baked goods. The villagers greeted their Duke and his new Duchess with a mixture of respect and curiosity, their bows and curtsies sincere if somewhat awkward. Georgiana spoke warmly with the farmers' wives, admired the children, and showed genuine interest in their lives. Philip observed her interactions with growing attention. Where other ladies of rank might have maintained aristocratic distance, Georgiana knelt in the dirt to speak with a small girl showing off her pet kitten, apparently unconcerned about her fine gown. It was as they were preparing to depart that they heard a commotion near one of the cottages. A woman was calling frantically for help, her voice sharp with panic. Philip and Georgiana hurried toward the sound, finding a distraught mother kneeling beside a small boy of perhaps 6 years, his face flushed with fever, his breathing labored. He has been sick for 2 days, the woman sobbed. I have tried everything, but he only grows worse. Georgiana knelt beside the child without hesitation, placing her hand on his burning forehead. Has he been able to keep down any liquids? Very little, Your Grace. He vomits everything I give him. We need to get him cooled down immediately, Georgiana said firmly. Bring me clean cloths and cool water. Philip, send someone for the physician at once. I am hardly qualified to diagnose, Philip began. Then I shall do it myself, Georgiana cut him off. That child needs help now, not after we debate proprieties. Philip stared at her for a moment, then nodded sharply and dispatched a rider for the doctor. Meanwhile, Georgiana worked with swift efficiency, cooling the child's fever, coaxing small sips of water past his cracked lips, speaking soothingly to both boy and mother. She stayed until the physician arrived, explained the symptoms she had observed, and only rose when assured the child would recover with proper care. As they rode back to Winterbourne Hall in the carriage, Philip was uncharacteristically silent. Finally, he spoke. That was remarkable. It was basic nursing, Georgiana replied, attempting to brush aside the compliment, even as her heart warmed at his words. It was compassion, Philip corrected. You did not hesitate, did not concern yourself with propriety or station. You saw someone in need and acted. That is not as common as you might think, particularly among our class. Anyone would have done the same. No, Philip said quietly. They would not have. Most would have sent for help and kept their distance. You knelt in the dirt and held that child yourself. Georgiana met his gaze and found something new there, something that looked almost like admiration. The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken possibility. That evening, Georgiana was writing to Louisa when Jane entered looking troubled. Your Grace, Lady Constance has arrived. She is with His Grace in the drawing room, and the voices are raised. Georgiana set down her pen immediately. How long has she been here? She came perhaps 10 minutes ago, Your Grace. She did not send word ahead. Georgiana made her way toward the drawing room, arriving just as Lady Constance's voice rose to a near shriek. You would believe her over me, your own blood. You have been spreading rumours about my wife throughout the county. Philip's voice was ice. You have been deliberately undermining her position while pretending friendship to her face. I was protecting you, Constance shot back, from a woman who clearly married you for your fortune and title. Everyone knows the circumstances of your hasty marriage, Philip. Her father was drowning in debt. You were a convenient solution to her problems. Georgiana stepped into the doorway. If you have accusations to make about me, Lady Constance, perhaps you should make them to my face rather than behind my back. Constance whirled, her face flushed with fury. How dare you eavesdrop on a private conversation? How dare you spread lies about me throughout Devonshire? Georgiana countered, moving into the room with her head held high. I have done nothing to earn your hostility beyond accepting a marriage proposal that your cousin extended to me. A marriage proposal you accepted with unseemly haste, Constance hissed. Tell me, did you even read the contract before signing? Or were you so desperate to secure a duke that you would have agreed to anything? My reasons for accepting Philip's proposal are between him and myself, Georgiana replied, keeping her voice level despite the rage building within her. But I will not stand by while you poison society against me. The truth is not poison, Constance said coldly. You are nothing but a fortune hunter who happened to catch Philip at a vulnerable moment. Once he tires of you, as he certainly will, you will be cast aside like every other woman who has failed to hold his interest. That is enough. Philip's voice cracked through the room like a whip. You will apologize to my wife immediately, or you will leave Winterbourne Hall and not return. Constance gaped at him. You cannot be serious. I am family, Philip. We have known each other since childhood. And you have repaid that lifelong connection by attempting to destroy my wife's reputation, Philip replied, his expression harder than Georgiana had ever seen it. I have learned that you shared details of my marriage contract with Lord Edmund Hartley and heaven knows who else, spreading information that was private and confidential. You claim to be protecting me, but your actions have only created scandal and difficulty. Edmund is family too, Constance protested. He had a right to know about your sudden marriage. And if I shared certain details, it was only because I was concerned about the family's interests. The family's interests, Philip repeated dangerously. Or your own. You had grown quite comfortable managing Winterbourne in my mother's absence, had you not? Comfortable enough to establish lucrative arrangements with suppliers who happened to be your relatives and friends. Comfortable enough to resist any suggestion that your management might be improved upon. Constance's face drained of colour. That is a lie. It is documented fact, Georgiana said quietly. I have the ledgers to prove it, if you would care to review them. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Constance drew herself up with what remained of her dignity. I see how it is. A few weeks of pretty smiles, and you have completely beguiled him, made him turn against his own family. A well-played, Duchess. Well played indeed. Leave, Philip said coldly. Now, and do not return to Winterbourne unless specifically invited. After Constance swept from the room in a storm of silk and fury, silence fell heavily. Georgiana sank into a chair, suddenly exhausted by the confrontation. I am sorry, Philip said quietly. For what she said to you. For the position my deception has placed you in. You need not apologize for her cruelty, Georgiana replied. Though I would appreciate an acknowledgement that your own actions contributed to this situation. Philip moved to pour himself a brandy, then thought better of it and sat across from her instead. You were magnificent today. Both with the child in the village, and just now with Constance. You did not back down, did not allow her to diminish you. I have been diminished enough in my life, Georgiana said tiredly. I will not accept it in my own home. This is your home, Philip said, meeting her gaze directly. I realize I have not made you feel welcome, have not treated you as a wife should be treated, but you belong here, Georgiana. Your actions these past weeks have proven that beyond question. It was the first time he had truly acknowledged her worth, and Georgiana felt tears prick at her eyes. She blinked them away quickly. Thank you. That means more than you know. That night, after retiring to her chambers, Georgiana took up her pen to write to Louisa. She described the changes at Winterbourne, the challenges she had faced and overcome, the gradual thawing between herself and Philip. But she did not mention the feelings growing in her heart, the dangerous affection for a man who had trapped her, yet now seemed to value her beyond the terms of their contract. Some truths were too complicated, too uncertain to commit to paper. Instead, she wrote of hope, of small victories, of a future that seemed less bleak than the one she had imagined on her wedding day. And if that hope was built on shifting sand, if those feelings might prove as illusory as morning mist, at least for tonight, she could allow herself to believe that something real was beginning to bloom in the ruins of their arranged marriage. Outside her window, the first stars appeared in the clearing sky, and somewhere in the house, Philip sat in his study thinking not of contracts or obligations, but of a woman with golden hair and green eyes who had knelt in the dirt to comfort a sick child and stood unbowed before his cousin's cruelty. Something was changing at Winterbourne Hall, something neither of them had planned, but both were beginning to hope might survive the cold winter ahead. The winter months passed with deceptive tranquility. Snow blanketed Winterbourne's grounds, transforming the estate into something from a fairy tale, all white drifts and crystalline trees. Inside the warm confines of the house, Georgiana and Philip fell into a pattern that resembled friendship, if not quite the intimacy of marriage. They took meals together more often than not, spent evenings in the library discussing books and estate matters, and gradually the walls between them seemed to thin. Yet beneath this comfortable routine, Georgiana felt a growing unease. Philip's 33rd birthday approached, the date that would secure his mother's inheritance and mark, theoretically, the end of the 1 year he had initially promised her. She found herself counting the days with increasing anxiety, wondering if he would honor that verbal promise, or if the contract she had signed would prove the only truth that mattered. She said nothing. To raise the subject would reveal how much it weighed upon her mind, would expose the vulnerability she had worked so hard to conceal. If Philip intended to release her, he would do so without prompting. And if he did not, well, she had already accepted that reality once. She could do so again, no matter how much it cost her heart. For Philip was becoming increasingly difficult to resist. The cold, distant man who had trapped her in marriage had revealed layers she had not anticipated. His dry wit made her laugh despite herself. His intelligence challenged her own. And in unguarded moments, when he thought she was not looking, she caught glimpses of something warmer in his expression, something that made her foolish heart hope for what could never be. She received regular letters from Louisa, full of news about Thomas Whitmore, the young solicitor who had apparently become a frequent caller at their father's house. "He brings me books, dearest sister," Louisa wrote in her flowing hand, "and we discuss them for hours. Father approves of him, though he worries Thomas's prospects are not yet established. But I care nothing for fortune when there is true regard." "Is that terribly foolish of me?" Georgiana pressed the letter to her chest, grateful that at least one of them might know love in marriage. That Louisa's sacrifice had not been in vain, even if her own heart was breaking by slow degrees. As February arrived and Philip's birthday drew near, she noticed changes in his behaviour. He became withdrawn again, spending long hours in his study, emerging only for meals that he barely touched. The easy conversations they had enjoyed throughout the winter dried up, replaced by stilted politeness that felt worse than his initial coldness. "Is something troubling you?" Georgiana finally asked one evening, unable to bear the tension any longer. Philip looked up from the papers before him, his expression unreadable. "Nothing that concerns you." The dismissal stung more than it should have. "I am your wife. Everything that troubles you concerns me." "Are you?" Philip asked quietly. "Or are you simply a woman fulfilling the terms of a contract?" Georgiana felt as though he had struck her. "That is unfair. You are the one who insisted on those terms." "Yes," Philip agreed, returning his attention to his papers. "I did." She left him then, retreating to her chambers with tears burning behind her eyes. Whatever closeness they had built over the winter was crumbling, and she did not know how to stop it. The day of Philip's birthday arrived with clear, cold sunshine. Mrs. Prescott had organized a celebration befitting a duke's importance, inviting the local gentry and several of Philip's friends from London. The house bustled with preparations, servants polishing silver and arranging flowers despite the season's limitations. Georgiana dressed carefully in a gown of deep burgundy silk, one of the few formal pieces in her wardrobe that still felt appropriate for such an occasion. Jane arranged her hair in an elegant style, threading through it a delicate gold chain that had been her grandmother's. "You look beautiful, Your Grace," Jane said softly. "His Grace will surely notice." But when Georgiana descended to the drawing room where pre-dinner drinks were being served, Philip barely glanced at her. He was surrounded by London friends, laughing at some joke she had not heard, and she felt suddenly like an intruder in her own home. The dinner was elaborate, course after course served on the finest china, accompanied by wines from Philip's extensive cellars. Georgiana sat at the opposite end of the long table, making polite conversation with the gentlemen on either side of her, while watching her husband charm the assembled company with the ease of long practice. It was only after dinner, when the men rejoined the ladies in the grand salon, that the Duke's solicitor arrived from London. Mr. Pemberton was an elderly man with silver hair and a grave demeanour, carrying a leather case that everyone recognised immediately. "Your Grace," he said, bowing to Philip, "I bring confirmation from your mother's trustees. All conditions of the late Duchess's will have been satisfied. The inheritance is now fully vested in your name." A ripple of congratulations swept through the assembled guests. Philip accepted them with characteristic composure, though Georgiana noticed his hand tighten around his brandy glass. "The properties in Kent and Surrey, the investments in shipping and railways, all are now yours to command," Mr. Pemberton continued. "The trust has been dissolved as per your mother's instructions. I have all the documents here for your signature." "Tomorrow will be sufficient," Philip replied. "Tonight is for celebration." But there was no celebration in his eyes, only something that looked almost like dread. The party continued late into the night, but Georgiana excused herself as soon as propriety allowed, claiming a headache that was not entirely false. She made her way to the conservatory, a glass-enclosed room at the rear of the house where exotic plants thrived despite the winter cold. It was her favourite refuge when she needed solitude, and she had not expected to find anyone else there. She was sitting among the ferns, breathing in the humid, earth-scented air, when Philip's voice startled her. "I thought I might find you here." Georgiana turned to find him silhouetted in the doorway, still in his evening clothes, his cravat loosened and his hair slightly disarrayed as though he had run his fingers through it repeatedly. "I needed some quiet," she said. "Your friends are very enthusiastic." Philip moved into the conservatory, closing the door behind him. "They are celebrating my good fortune. Apparently, I am now one of the wealthiest men in England." "You were already wealthy." "Not like this." He gestured vaguely. "My father's estate was substantial, but my mother's fortune dwarfs it. Railways, shipping companies, textile mills. She was an heiress in her own right, you see. Her father built an empire, and she inherited all of it." "Then congratulations are in order," Georgiana said, proud of how steady her voice remained. "You have achieved what you set out to accomplish." Philip was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "When I proposed this arrangement to you, I promised that it would be temporary. 1 year, I said, after which we would..." Reassess. Georgiana's heart began to pound. I remember. It has been nearly a year now. Philip continued, his gaze fixed on some point beyond the glass walls. The inheritance is secure. The conditions are met. I could, in theory, honor that promise. In theory, Georgiana repeated, the words bitter on her tongue. I find myself uncertain, Philip admitted, finally meeting her eyes. When I made that promise, I believed I knew what I wanted. A business arrangement, nothing more. A wife who would fulfill the requirements without complicating my life with expectations of affection. And now? Georgiana asked, though part of her did not want to hear the answer. Now I find the situation more complex than I anticipated. Philip moved closer, close enough that she could see the conflict in his expression. You have become integral to Winterbourne, to my life. The thought of you leaving is not as simple as I expected it to be. Hope and anger warred within Georgiana's chest. So you wish to keep me here? Like a competent housekeeper you have grown accustomed to? That is not what I meant, Philip said, frustration creeping into his voice. Then what did you mean? Georgiana demanded, rising to face him directly. Be honest with me for once, Philip. Do you wish me to stay because you value my presence, or because dissolving this marriage would be inconvenient? I do not know, Philip said, and the raw honesty of the admission was somehow worse than any lie. I have spent 5 years building walls around my heart, Georgiana, ensuring that I would never again be vulnerable to betrayal. And then you arrived, and somehow, without my permission or intention, you began dismantling those walls stone by stone. Is that my fault? Georgiana asked, her voice breaking. Should I apologize for being kind, for doing my duty well, for trying to make the best of circumstances you forced upon me? No, Philip said quietly. You should not. But neither can I simply decide overnight that I am capable of the kind of marriage you deserve. The kind where a husband loves his wife freely, without fear or reservation. Tears spilled down Georgiana's cheeks despite her efforts to contain them. I did not ask for your love, Philip. I asked for honesty. I asked to understand my own future. But you cannot even give me that, can you? You want me to remain in this limbo, waiting while you organize your feelings, never certain if I am truly valued or merely convenient. Georgiana. Philip reached for her hand, but she pulled away. No, she said firmly. You have had a year to consider your feelings, a year in which you barely spoke to me for the first months, then gradually allowed me closer, only to retreat again as soon as your inheritance was secure. I will not spend another year in such uncertainty. What are you saying? Philip asked, something like fear entering his expression. I am saying that I need time away from you, Georgiana replied, wiping her tears with trembling fingers. Time to think clearly, without your presence confusing everything. I will remain at Winterbourne because legally I have no choice, but I request separate quarters, separate schedules, separate lives. If you cannot determine what you want from this marriage, then I will at least preserve what remains of my dignity. You would wall yourself away from me? Philip's voice held disbelief. You walled yourself away from me first, Georgiana countered. For months. I am simply following your example. She moved past him toward the door, but his voice stopped her. I never meant to hurt you. Georgiana paused without turning. That may be true, but intention matters little when the result is the same. She left him standing alone among the exotic plants, surrounded by beauty he could not see because he was too trapped in his own fears to reach for what stood before him. The following days were agony. Georgiana kept to her chambers as much as possible, taking meals in her sitting room and declining invitations to the library in the evenings. She resumed her household duties, but did so with cool efficiency, treating Philip with the same distant courtesy she might show any employer. Philip, for his part, seemed paralyzed by indecision. Mrs. Prescott reported that he spent long hours in his study, emerging only to ride across the estate in weather that was entirely unsuitable for such excursions. He looked haggard, his face drawn, his usual composure cracking at the edges. He asked after you this morning, Jane reported one day as she helped Georgiana dress. Wanted to know if you were unwell. Tell him I am perfectly well. Georgiana replied. Simply occupied with my duties. But she was not well. Her heart ached with every breath, torn between the love she had not meant to feel and the knowledge that Philip could not or would not reciprocate it. She had saved her family, yes, and she took pride in what she had accomplished at Winterbourne, but at what cost to herself? A letter arrived from Louisa, full of joy. Thomas Whitmore had formally asked for her hand, and their father had consented. The wedding would be in June, a simple country affair, and Louisa desperately hoped Georgiana could attend. He loves me, dearest sister, Louisa wrote, truly loves me, not my fortune or my family connections, but me. Can you imagine such a thing? To be chosen simply for oneself? I wish the same for you, though I know your situation is more complicated. But perhaps in time, the Duke will come to value you as you deserve. Any man would be fortunate to earn your affection. Georgiana set the letter aside, unable to read more. Louisa's happiness was a gift she had purchased with her own prospects, and she would not regret that sacrifice. But it stung nonetheless to know that her sister would have what she could not. A marriage based on love rather than contract. A husband who had chosen her freely rather than trapped her with legal manipulation. February gave way to March, and still the impasse continued. Winterbourne Hall had become a prison of beautiful rooms and painful silences, and Georgiana knew that something would have to break soon. The question was what, and whether either of them would survive the shattering. The March winds battered Winterbourne Hall with relentless fury, mirroring the turbulence within its walls. Georgiana maintained her careful distance from Philip, their interactions limited to necessary exchanges conducted with painful politeness. The household staff moved about their duties with quiet discomfort, sensing the tension between Duke and Duchess, but powerless to address it. It was during one of these grey, wind-swept afternoons that Georgiana sat in her sitting room reviewing correspondence when Harrington entered with the day's post. Among the usual invitations and household bills lay a letter with no return address, sealed with ordinary wax rather than a family crest. Something about it immediately set her nerves on edge. She dismissed Harrington and broke the seal with trembling fingers. The handwriting was masculine and unfamiliar, the tone unmistakable in its menace. Your Grace, it began with false courtesy, I write to inform you of matters concerning your marriage that may be of considerable interest to certain parties. It has come to my attention that the Duke of Winterbourne contracted matrimony with you under circumstances that some might consider fraudulent, specifically for the purpose of securing an inheritance to which he would not otherwise be entitled. Such information, if made public, could cast doubt upon the legitimacy of said inheritance and bring considerable scandal upon your household. I am prepared to discuss this matter privately before taking any formal action. I shall call upon Winterbourne Hall 3 days hence at 2 in the afternoon. I trust you will receive me. Your servant, Lord Edmund Hartley. Georgiana read the letter 3 times, her mind racing. Edmund Hartley, the man who had stolen Philip's first love, who had humiliated him publicly by eloping with his bride on their wedding day. And now he sought to destroy Philip's inheritance by exposing the transactional nature of their marriage. The threat was clear and devastating. If Edmund could convince the courts that Philip's marriage had been a sham designed solely to fulfill the terms of his mother's will, the inheritance could be challenged, possibly overturned. Even if such a legal challenge ultimately failed, the scandal would be tremendous. Philip's reputation, already scarred by one public humiliation, would be destroyed entirely. Georgiana's first instinct was to take the letter immediately to Philip, but she hesitated, her hand hovering over the bell pull that would summon a servant. Philip had made it clear he did not know what he wanted from their marriage. He had retreated behind his walls again, leaving her in painful limbo. Would he even believe she wished to help him, or would he assume she welcomed this disaster as an opportunity to escape? No, she decided. She would handle this herself. If Edmund thought to find an easy victim in a supposedly loveless marriage, he would discover his mistake. Over the next 2 days, Georgiana worked with quiet determination. She gathered the household ledgers, showing the financial improvements she had implemented, demonstrating genuine management rather than mere pretense. She collected letters from local gentry thanking her for various charitable works and social engagements, proving her active integration into Devonshire society as a legitimate duchess. She secured affidavits from Mrs. Prescott and several other senior staff members, attesting to her fulfillment of all ducal duties. Most importantly, she enlisted the assistance of Mr. Harrington and Mr. Fletcher, the head gardener, both of whom had served the Grayson family for decades and commanded respect throughout the county. She explained the situation carefully, watching relief flood their faces, when she made clear her intention to protect the Duke rather than abandon him. "Your Grace," Harrington said gravely, "His Grace is fortunate in his choice of wife, whatever the circumstances of that choice." "I am not certain he would agree with you," Georgiana replied, "but I thank you nonetheless." On the appointed day, Georgiana dressed in her finest gown, a deep emerald silk that Philip had commissioned for her, but which she had never worn. She arranged her hair severely, every inch the Duchess of Winterbourne, and positioned herself in the formal receiving room to await her visitor. Lord Edmund Hartley arrived precisely at 2, and Georgiana felt her first jolt of genuine surprise. She had expected someone obviously dissolute, marked by years of poor living. Instead, Edmund was handsome in a way that Philip was not, with golden hair and blue eyes that might have seemed charming had they not held such calculated coldness. He was perhaps 35, well-dressed despite his alleged poverty, and moved with the confidence of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. "Your Grace," he bowed with exaggerated courtesy, "how kind of you to receive me. I was uncertain whether my letter would reach you directly or be intercepted by your husband. I handle all household correspondence," Georgiana replied coolly. "Please, be seated. I prefer to conduct business matters efficiently." Edmund's smile sharpened as he took the offered chair. "Business matters? How refreshingly direct. Then you understand the nature of my concerns regarding your marriage to my cousin." "You are not his cousin," Georgiana corrected. "You are a distant relation who married the woman who was to be Philip's wife. I would hardly characterize that connection as familial warmth." A flicker of annoyance crossed Edmund's handsome face. "Nevertheless, as a member of the extended Grayson family, I have an interest in ensuring that the family fortune is not obtained through deceptive means." "You mean you are bankrupt and desperate," Georgiana said flatly. "Lady Constance was quite forthcoming in her letters to you about our household affairs, was she not? She provided you with details about the hasty nature of my marriage to Philip, the financial circumstances of my family, enough information to construct a plausible accusation of fraud." Edmund's expression hardened. "I see you are better informed than I expected. That simplifies matters. Yes, I know your marriage was a transaction designed to fulfill the terms of Philip's mother's will. I know you were penniless, that your family faced ruin, that Philip essentially purchased you to secure his inheritance, all of which makes the marriage potentially fraudulent under the law. And what exactly do you want, Lord Hartley?" Georgiana asked, though she already knew the answer. £20,000, Edmund stated baldly. "A small fraction of Philip's newly acquired fortune, but sufficient to resolve my own difficulties. In exchange, I will keep silent about the circumstances of your marriage." "That is called extortion," Georgiana observed. "It is a criminal offence." "Prove it," Edmund challenged. "You have my letter, yes, but it contains no explicit demand for money, merely an expression of concern about family matters. If you attempt to involve the authorities, I will simply accelerate my plans to expose your fraudulent marriage publicly." Georgiana rose and moved to the window, her back to Edmund. "You have clearly thought this through carefully." "Unfortunately for you, so have I." She turned back to face him. "You assume that my marriage to Philip was fraudulent because it was contracted for financial purposes. But English law does not require love as a prerequisite for legitimate marriage. It requires only proper ceremony, legal capacity of both parties, and consummation, all of which occurred in our case." Edmund's confidence wavered slightly. "The intent matters. If the marriage was purely to fulfill a will's requirements, that constitutes fraud. Intent is difficult to prove," Georgiana countered, "particularly when substantial evidence demonstrates otherwise. For instance, I have documentation showing that I have performed all the duties of a duchess for nearly a year. I have managed the household, improved its finances significantly, integrated fully into local society, and fulfilled every obligation expected of my position. That hardly suggests a fraudulent arrangement. She moved to her desk and withdrew the portfolio she had prepared. I have letters from dozens of neighbouring families attesting to my active participation in Devonshire society. I have household accounts demonstrating genuine management and improvement. I have affidavits from senior staff members, some of whom have served the Grayson family for 40 years, swearing to the legitimacy of my role as Duchess. Edmund's face had gone pale. That proves nothing. You could have been performing those duties as part of the deception. For nearly a year, Georgiana raised an eyebrow. That demonstrates remarkable commitment to fraud, does it not? And consider this, Lord Hartley. If you bring these accusations publicly, you will need to prove them, which means subjecting yourself to legal scrutiny as well. How will it appear when it emerges that you received detailed information about a private marriage contract from Lady Constance Marlowe, who was dismissed from this household for corruption? That you used stolen private information to attempt extortion? I stole nothing, Edmund protested, though his voice had lost its earlier confidence. Lady Constance had no legal right to share details of Philip's private business, Georgiana replied. Her doing so was a breach of trust, and your use of that information makes you complicit. Moreover, there are witnesses to this conversation. On cue, the door opened to admit Harrington and Mr. Fletcher, both men's faces grave with disapproval. These gentlemen have heard everything you said, Georgiana continued. Your explicit demand for money, your threats to expose private family matters, your admission that Lady Constance provided you with confidential information. Should you attempt to make good on your threats, they will testify to your extortion attempt. Edmund shot to his feet, his face flushed with anger and fear. You cannot prove anything. Their word against mine. The word of two respected men who have lived in this community for decades, who have no financial interest in the outcome, against that of a bankrupt lord with clear monetary motivation. Georgiana shook her head. I rather think a court would find them credible. She moved closer, her voice dropping but losing none of its steel. However, I am not entirely without sympathy for your situation. You were foolish enough to marry a woman who bankrupted you, and now you face consequences of that choice. So I will make you a counteroffer. £5,000, paid immediately, in exchange for your signed agreement never to speak of Philip's marriage or inheritance to anyone. You will also provide a written statement that any information you received from Lady Constance was obtained without Philip's knowledge or consent. 5,000 is not nearly enough, Edmund protested weakly. It is 5,000 more than you will receive otherwise, Georgiana replied. And it is conditional upon your acceptance within the next 5 minutes. After that, I take this matter directly to Philip, and let him deal with you as he sees fit. Given your history with him, I suspect he will not be as generous as I am being. Edmund stared at her, conflict evident in his expression. Finally, his shoulders sagged in defeat. Very well. 5,000 and the written agreement. Harrington, please have Mr. Pemberton prepare the necessary documents, Georgiana instructed. Lord Hartley will wait here until everything is signed. As the solicitor was summoned and the papers drawn up, Edmund signed them with visible resentment. You are more formidable than I expected, he said, as Harrington witnessed the signature. Philip is fortunate in his choice, even if the circumstances were unorthodox. Philip's fortune in marriage is not your concern, Georgiana replied. You have your money. Now leave Winterbourne and do not return. After Edmund departed with his bank draft, Georgiana sank into a chair, her entire body trembling with delayed reaction. She had gambled everything on her assessment of Edmund's desperation, on her ability to turn his threats back upon him. If he had been less frightened or more determined, the confrontation might have ended very differently. That was masterfully done, Your Grace, Harrington said quietly. If I may be so bold, the late Duchess would have been proud of you. Georgiana looked up at the elderly butler. Thank you, Harrington. Though I suspect Philip may not share your assessment when he learns what I have done. On the contrary, a familiar voice said from the doorway. I am in awe of what you have done. Georgiana's heart stopped. Philip stood in the entrance, his expression unreadable. "How long have you been there?" "Long enough to hear Edmund's threats and your brilliant dismantling of them," Philip replied, moving into the room. "Harrington sent word to my study the moment Edmund arrived. I was listening from the adjoining room." "You let me face him alone?" Georgiana asked, uncertain whether to feel angry or relieved. "I trusted you to handle it," Philip said simply. "And you did, far better than I could have. Edmund would have enjoyed confronting me directly, using our history as a weapon. But he had no defense against your intelligence and courage." He crossed to where she sat and knelt before her, taking her hands in his. "Georgiana, you just saved my inheritance, my reputation, possibly my entire future. And you did it when you had every reason to let me face the consequences of my own manipulations. Why?" Georgiana looked down at their joined hands, tears threatening. "Because despite everything, despite the contract and the deception and the walls between us, you matter to me. Your happiness matters to me. And I could not stand by and watch Edmund destroy you." "I do not deserve you," Philip said, his voice rough with emotion. "I trapped you in a marriage you did not want, treated you with coldness and suspicion, and then had the audacity to be confused about my own feelings when you had every right to hate me. I do not hate you," Georgiana whispered. "Though heaven knows, I have tried." Philip raised one hand to cup her face, his thumb brushing away a tear that had escaped despite her efforts. "I have been a fool, Georgiana. A coward hiding behind contracts and conditions because I was too afraid to risk my heart again. But watching you face down Edmund, seeing your courage and your loyalty, even when I had given you so little reason for either, I finally understand what I've been too blind to see." "What is that?" Georgiana asked, barely daring to hope. "That I love you," Philip said, the words breaking free as though he had been holding them back for months. "Not because you are convenient or suitable or fulfill the terms of a contract, but because you are brave and intelligent and compassionate. Because you kneel in dirt to comfort sick children and stand unbowed before those who would diminish you. Because you saved my life today when you could have let me fall." Georgiana felt fresh tears streaming down her face. "You love me?" "With everything I am," Philip confirmed, "and I am terrified of it, but not as terrified as I am of losing you. Can you forgive me for taking so long to see what was before me all along?" Instead of answering with words, Georgiana leaned forward and kissed him, pouring into that kiss all the fear and hope and love she had been holding back for months. Philip responded with equal fervour, his arms coming around her to pull her close, and for the first time since their wedding day, Georgiana felt truly claimed by the man who was her husband. When they finally parted, both breathless, Philip rested his forehead against hers. "I will spend the rest of my life proving that I am worthy of you. Just love me," Georgiana replied softly. "That will be enough." The evening after their confrontation with Edmund, Philip and Georgiana sat together in the library, the fire crackling softly in the hearth. The kiss they had shared earlier had changed everything between them, dissolving walls that had stood for nearly a year. Yet both sensed that words were still needed, truths that had been too long buried. "There are things you should know," Philip began, his hand clasped firmly around hers, as though fearing she might vanish. "About Catherine, about Edmund, about why I became the man you met that night in London. You do not have to explain," Georgiana said gently. "What matters is now." "No," Philip insisted. "You deserve to understand. After what you did today, after you protected me when you had every reason to let me fall, you deserve all the truth." He rose and poured himself a small glass of brandy, not from need, but simply to have something to occupy his hands. Catherine Hartley was beautiful, accomplished, everything society deemed perfect for a duchess. I met her during my second season, when I was 23, and foolish enough to believe in romance. She seemed to return my regard, and her father approved the match. Our engagement was announced with great fanfare. Georgiana listened in silence, seeing the pain etched in every line of his face as he spoke. "What I did not know," Philip continued, "was that Catherine had been corresponding secretly with Edmund for months. He had always been charming, the sort of man who collected admirers the way others collect books. but I never imagined he would pursue my intended bride. How did you discover the truth? Georgiana asked. Philip's laugh was bitter. The morning of our wedding, a letter arrived. Catherine wrote that she had realized, upon learning the full extent of Edmund's inheritance from his maternal uncle, that he offered greater prospects than I did. My father's estate was entailed, you see, and while wealthy, it was nothing compared to the shipping fortune Edmund stood to inherit. She had made what she called a practical decision, choosing Edmund over me the night before our wedding. Oh, Philip, Georgiana breathed. 500 guests were already arriving at the church, Philip said, draining his glass. I had to stand before them all and announce that there would be no wedding, that my bride had chosen another man. The whispers, the pitying looks, the barely concealed satisfaction of those who had always envied my position. It was devastating. He returned to sit beside her, taking both her hands now. But worse than the public humiliation was the private realization that Catherine had never loved me at all. She had assessed me as one might assess a horse at auction, found me wanting compared to Edmund's superior prospects, and discarded me accordingly. Every word of affection, every tender moment had been calculated deception. Not every person is capable of such cruelty, Georgiana said, echoing her earlier words from months ago. I know that now, Philip replied, but at the time, the betrayal destroyed something in me. I withdrew from society for nearly a year, refusing all invitations, all attempts at connection. When I finally emerged, I had built walls so high that nothing could reach me. I vowed never to be vulnerable again, never to place my heart in another's keeping. And then your mothers will force you to marry, Georgiana said, understanding more now. Philip nodded. 5 years after Catherine's betrayal, my mother's death revealed the stipulation in her will. Marriage before my 33rd birthday, or lose her entire fortune. At first, I raged against it, saw it as another betrayal, but then I realized it offered an opportunity. To control the situation, Georgiana guessed. To marry on your terms rather than risk emotional entanglement. Precisely, Philip confirmed. I spent months researching potential candidates, women who would accept a business arrangement without expecting love. When I learned of your family's difficulties, of your sister's predicament, you seemed ideal. Desperate enough to accept, intelligent enough to fulfill the role convincingly, but with no leverage to demand more than I was willing to give. That is why there was no exit clause, Georgiana said. You needed to ensure I could not leave you as Catherine did. Yes, Philip admitted, shame colouring his voice. I told myself it was practical, that I was simply protecting my interests, but the truth was darker. I was terrified of being abandoned again, so I created a situation where abandonment was legally impossible. It was manipulative and wrong, and I have no excuse beyond my own cowardice. Georgiana was silent for a long moment, absorbing this confession. Then she said quietly, I have my own truths to share. Philip looked at her, surprise evident in his expression. I have spent my entire life feeling inadequate, Georgiana continued. Too plain to attract suitors, too poor to be desirable, too old to be considered marriageable. My younger sisters were always the pretty ones, the charming ones, the ones worthy of attention. I was simply Georgiana, useful for managing the household, convenient for running errands, but never the daughter anyone actually chose. That cannot be true, Philip protested. Your father clearly values you. He values what I can do for him, Georgiana corrected gently. As you initially valued what I could do for you. When you proposed that night in London, I knew it was a transaction. Part of me was grateful because at least someone found me useful enough to marry, even if the reasons had nothing to do with any worth I possessed as a person. Philip's grip on her hands tightened. I was a fool not to see your worth immediately. You saw what you needed to see, Georgiana replied. A solution to your problem. But Philip, over these months, as you gradually let me closer, I began to hope for something I had thought impossible. I began to fall in love with you, and it terrified me because I knew our arrangement was never meant to include such feelings. Georgiana, Philip said, his voice rough with emotion. Let me finish, she insisted. When your birthday approached and you became distant again, I thought perhaps you regretted allowing me close. that you were preparing to push me away permanently. The pain of that possibility was worse than anything I had experienced, because for a brief time, I had glimpsed what it might be like to be truly valued by someone I had come to love. Philip pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly. I was not pushing you away because I regretted our growing closeness. I was terrified by it. Terrified of how much I had come to depend on your presence, your intelligence, your warmth. Terrified that if I acknowledged these feelings, I would become vulnerable again. They held each other in silence for several minutes, years of pain and fear slowly dissolving in the comfort of shared honesty. Finally, Philip spoke. Tomorrow, I will instruct Mr. Pemberton to draft a new contract, one that gives you complete financial independence, joint ownership of the Surrey properties, and absolute legal freedom to leave this marriage at any time you choose. Georgiana pulled back to look at him. Why would you do that? Because you deserve the choice I took from you. Philip replied simply. Because I want you to stay, not because a contract binds you, but because you choose to be here. Because real love cannot exist under compulsion, only by free will. And if I choose to stay? Georgiana asked, her heart in her throat. Then I will spend every day of the rest of my life proving that your choice was not misplaced, Philip promised. I will be the husband you deserve, the partner you need, the man who finally had the wisdom to recognize the extraordinary woman before him. Georgiana touched his face gently, tracing the strong line of his jaw. I choose to stay, Philip. Not because of any contract, old or new, but because despite everything, I love you. The walls you built to protect yourself, the fears that drove you to manipulate me, even the coldness that greeted me when I first arrived. I understand all of it now, and I choose to remain. You are far more forgiving than I deserve, Philip said. I am practical, Georgiana corrected with a small smile. I recognize that you made mistakes born of pain rather than malice. And I have seen you change, seen you struggle to overcome those fears. That takes courage, Philip. Perhaps more courage than never having walls at all. He kissed her then, slowly and thoroughly, a promise sealed not by signatures on parchment, but by the meeting of two hearts that had finally found safe harbour in each other. The following week, Mr. Pemberton arrived from London with the new contract Philip had commissioned. The elderly solicitor spread the documents across Philip's desk, explaining each clause with meticulous care. As you instructed, Your Grace, this agreement grants the Duchess complete financial independence. She receives an annual income of £5,000 from the Surrey estates, paid directly to her with no oversight required from you. She holds joint title to Meadowbrook Manor and its surrounding lands, meaning she may sell or lease those properties as she sees fit. And most significantly, she has absolute legal right to dissolve this marriage at any time, with no financial penalty or loss of the settlements previously described. Philip signed each page without hesitation, then pushed the documents toward Georgiana. Read them carefully. Mr. Pemberton will answer any questions you have. There should be no secrets between us, not anymore. Georgiana reviewed the contract thoroughly, Mr. Pemberton patiently clarifying various legal terms. When she reached the final page, she looked up at Philip. This is extraordinarily generous. You're essentially giving me freedom to leave you and take a substantial portion of your wealth with me. I am giving you what should have been yours from the beginning, Philip corrected. The choice to stay or go, made freely and without coercion. Georgiana picked up the pen, then paused. Philip, I need you to understand something. This contract is beautifully written, legally sound, and more than fair. But it changes nothing about my decision. I'm not staying because of property or money. I'm staying because I love you. I know, Philip said softly. But I needed to offer it regardless, not to convince you to stay, but to prove that I trust you enough to give you the power to leave. With a smile, Georgiana signed her name beside his. Then, to Mr. Pemberton's evident shock, she took the beautifully written document and tore it cleanly in half. Your Grace! The solicitor gasped. That contract took days to prepare. And it served its purpose, Georgiana replied calmly. Philip needed to make the offer to prove his trust. I needed to reject it to prove my choice. We do not need contracts between us anymore, Mr. Pemberton. We need only each other. Philip stared at her, something like wonder in his expression. Then he dismissed the bewildered solicitor and pulled Georgiana into his arms. "You are the most remarkable woman I have ever known." "I am simply a woman who knows what she wants," Georgiana replied. "And what I want is a marriage built on love and trust, not legal documents." That night, for the first time since their wedding, Philip came to Georgiana's chambers, not as a distant husband fulfilling obligations, but as a man claiming his wife fully and completely. What passed between them in the privacy of her rooms was tender and passionate, the physical expression of emotions that had been building for months. When morning light finally crept through the curtains, they lay entwined, truly married at last in every sense that mattered. "No more walls," Philip murmured against her hair. "No more walls," Georgiana agreed, her hand resting over his heart. "Just us together, for however many years we are granted." Outside, spring was finally arriving in earnest at Winterbourne Hall. The gardens Philip's mother had begun planning years ago were ready for completion under Georgiana's guidance. The household hummed with new efficiency under her management. And in London, news had already begun to spread that the Duke and Duchess of Winterbourne, who had married so hastily and mysteriously, had been spotted looking at each other with unmistakable devotion. Lady Constance, learning of Edmund's defeat and payment, retired to her own small estate in disgrace. Lord Edmund Hartley took his £5,000 and disappeared to the continent, never to trouble the Grayson family again. And at Ashworth House, Louisa prepared for her June wedding to Thomas Whitmore, grateful beyond measure for the sister whose sacrifice had given her the freedom to marry for love. The wounds of the past would take time to fully heal, Georgiana knew. But healing had begun, and that was enough. She had come to Winterbourne as a prisoner of circumstance, trapped by deception and desperation. She would remain as a duchess by choice, bound only by love and the quiet certainty that she and Philip had found in each other what they had both believed impossible, a second chance at happiness, built on truth rather than lies, on trust rather than contracts, on love rather than necessity. Spring had arrived in full bloom at Winterbourne Hall, and with it came a sense of renewal that extended far beyond the gardens. The weeks following Philip and Georgiana's reconciliation passed in a haze of rediscovered companionship and deepening affection. They walked the estate grounds together each morning, planned the completion of Philip's mother's garden designs, and spent evenings in the library, not as two people fulfilling obligations, but as husband and wife, genuinely enjoying each other's company. Yet one matter remained unresolved. True to his promise, Philip had commissioned Mr. Pemberton to draft a new marriage contract, one that would grant Georgiana complete independence and the freedom to leave if she chose. The documents arrived from London on a bright April morning, delivered with the solicitor's usual meticulous attention to detail. "Everything is in order, Your Graces," Mr. Pemberton explained as he spread the papers across Philip's desk. "The Duchess receives an independent annual income of £5,000 drawn from the Surrey estates. She holds joint title to Meadowbrook Manor and its surrounding properties, with full authority to sell, lease, or manage them as she sees fit. And most significantly, she possesses absolute legal right to dissolve this marriage at any time, with no financial penalty or loss of previously granted settlements." Georgiana read through the documents carefully, Philip watching her face for any reaction. The contract was extraordinarily generous, effectively making her one of the wealthiest women in England in her own right, beholden to no one. "This is remarkable," Georgiana said finally. "You are giving me complete freedom." "I am giving you what should have been yours from the beginning," Philip replied. "The choice to stay or go, made freely and without coercion." Mr. Pemberton cleared his throat. "If both parties are satisfied, we need only your signatures to make this legally binding." Philip signed without hesitation, then pushed the documents toward Georgiana. She took the pen, her hand hovering over the signature line for a long moment. Then she set the pen down and looked directly at her husband. "Philip, I appreciate what you are trying to do. This contract is beautifully written, legally sound and more than fair, but it changes nothing about my decision." "I know," Philip said softly, "but I needed to offer it regardless, not to convince you to stay, but to prove that I trust you enough to give you the power to leave." Georgiana smiled, picked up the contract and tore it cleanly in half. Mr. Pemberton gasped in horror. "Your Grace! That document took days to prepare, and it served its purpose," Georgiana replied calmly. Philip needed to make the offer to prove his trust. I needed to reject it to prove my choice. We do not need contracts between us anymore, Mr. Pemberton. We need only each other. After the bewildered solicitor departed, Philip pulled Georgiana into his arms. "You never cease to amaze me. I am simply a woman who knows what she wants," Georgiana replied, resting her head against his chest. "And what I want is a marriage built on love and trust, not legal documents." 2 weeks later, they travelled to London at Georgiana's request. She had received an urgent letter from Louisa, filled with such obvious joy that Georgiana knew immediately what news awaited them. The journey to Ashworth House brought back memories of that desperate night when Georgiana had accepted Philip's proposal, believing she was trading 1 year for her family's salvation. How different everything seemed now, travelling not as strangers bound by contract, but as husband and wife genuinely devoted to each other. They arrived to find Ashworth House transformed. The grounds, once neglected due to financial constraints, now showed signs of careful maintenance. Inside, the furnishings that had been sold to pay creditors had been replaced with modest but respectable pieces. Most striking was the change in Viscount Fairmont himself. The haunted, defeated man Georgiana had left behind had been replaced by someone who stood straighter, spoke more confidently, and met his daughter's eyes without shame. "Georgiana," he embraced her warmly. "And Your Grace, welcome. We are honoured by your visit." "Please call me Philip," he replied, shaking the older man's hand. "We are family, after all." Before more could be said, Louisa burst into the room, her face radiant with happiness. She flew into Georgiana's arms with all the enthusiasm of her 16 years. "Oh, sister, I have so much to tell you. Where do I even begin? Perhaps with the young man who has been calling 3 times a week," their father suggested with a fond smile. Louisa blushed prettily. "Thomas Whitmore has formally asked for my hand, and father has consented. We are to be married in June, just a small country wedding, nothing elaborate. But oh, Georgiana, I am so happy I could burst." Georgiana held her sister at arm's length, studying her glowing face. "Tell me about him, everything." Over tea, Louisa described Thomas in detail. He was 24, recently established as a solicitor in the nearby town, intelligent and kind, with prospects that, while modest, now showed great promise for the future. Most importantly, he loved Louisa for herself, had courted her properly, and treated her with the respect and affection every young woman deserved. "He brings me books," Louisa said, her eyes shining, "and we discuss them for hours. He values my opinions, Georgiana. He actually listens when I speak and considers what I say worthy of thought. Can you imagine?" Georgiana could imagine, having found the same rare gift in Philip. "I am so happy for you, dearest. You deserve every bit of this joy." Later, when the sisters had a moment alone, Louisa took Georgiana's hands earnestly. "I know what you sacrificed for me. That night when you married the Duke, you believed you were trading your entire future so that I could be free. I will never forget that, sister. Never. You would have done the same for me," Georgiana replied, squeezing her hands. "Perhaps," Louisa agreed. "But I would not have done it with such grace, and I certainly would not have managed to make the Duke fall desperately in love with me in the process." Georgiana blinked in surprise. "How did you know? The way he looks at you," Louisa said simply. "As though you are the sun and he has been living in darkness all his life. That is not the gaze of a man fulfilling contractual obligations, sister. That is love, true and deep." That evening, as Georgiana and Philip prepared to return to their London townhouse for the night, Viscount Fairmont drew his daughter aside. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly, "for placing you in a position where you felt you had no choice but to accept the Duke's proposal, for allowing our family's circumstances to become so desperate that you had to sacrifice yourself." "Father," Georgiana began, but he raised a hand. "Let me finish. What I did not tell you then, because I was too ashamed, was that many of my financial difficulties came from poor choices I made out of pride and foolishness. I gambled on investments I did not understand, trusted men I should have investigated more carefully, and refused to admit my mistakes until it was nearly too late. He met her eyes directly. But the elimination of those debts gave me a second chance. I have been more careful, more humble, and more thoughtful in my business dealings since then. The family is not wealthy, but we are secure, and that security came at the cost of your freedom. I am deeply sorry. You need not apologize, Georgiana said gently. What began as necessity has become the greatest blessing of my life. I would not change a single moment, painful though some of them were. The Viscount embraced his eldest daughter, perhaps truly seeing her worth for the first time. The Duke is fortunate in his choice of wife. I am equally fortunate in my husband, Georgiana replied. The journey back to Winterbourne Hall took them through the Surrey countryside, where Meadowbrook Manor stood among rolling hills and ancient oak trees. Though the property now belonged jointly to both of them according to estate records, Georgiana had never actually visited it. Would you like to stop? Philip asked as they approached. It is yours as much as mine. You should see it. The manor proved to be a charming Georgian residence, smaller than Winterbourne, but beautifully proportioned, surrounded by gardens that showed evidence of loving care despite having no permanent occupants. It was my mother's favourite retreat, Philip explained as they walked through the light-filled rooms. She would come here when she needed peace, away from the demands of being a duchess. I thought perhaps you might like to use it the same way, or we could establish it as a place for your family to visit. Whatever you wish. Georgiana moved to the windows overlooking the garden, imagining Louisa and Thomas visiting with their future children, her father finding tranquility in his later years. I think it should be a place for family, she said. Yours and mine. A place where love is always welcome. Yistrul, they returned to Winterbourne as May gave way to June, arriving home to find the estate in full summer glory. The gardens Philip's mother had envisioned were finally complete under Georgiana's direction, a harmonious blend of formal structure and natural beauty that drew visitors from across Devonshire. On their first evening back, Philip took Georgiana's hand and led her to the library, the room where so much of their relationship had unfolded. He guided her to the window seat where they had shared their first genuine conversation months ago. I have something to ask you, he said, kneeling before her in a mirror of that moment in the conservatory when he had first confessed his love. And I need to do it properly this time. From his coat, he withdrew a small velvet box. Inside lay a ring, not the heavy grace and emerald she had worn since their hasty wedding, but something altogether different. A delicate band of gold set with small sapphires that caught the evening light like captured stars. This was my mother's, Philip explained. Not her formal wedding ring, but one my father gave her on their 10th anniversary when they had weathered difficulties and emerged stronger. It represents not the obligation of marriage, but the choice to remain, freely given. He took Georgiana's hand, his voice thick with emotion. Georgiana Fairmont Grayson, Duchess of Winterbourne, wife of my heart, will you marry me? Not because a contract binds you, not because circumstances compelled you, but because you choose to spend your life with me. Tears streamed down Georgiana's face. Yes, she whispered. 1,000 times yes. Philip slipped the ring onto her finger beside the formal grace and emerald, then pulled her into his arms. Then let us do it properly. A real ceremony, with your family present, vows spoken from the heart rather than read from a book. 2 weeks later, in the small chapel on the Winterbourne estate, surrounded by family and friends, Philip and Georgiana renewed their wedding vows. Louisa served as witness, radiant in anticipation of her own wedding in 3 weeks' time. The Viscount gave his daughter away, this time with joy rather than desperation. And when the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, Philip kissed his bride with all the love he had been too afraid to show the first time. The celebration that followed was intimate and genuine, filled with laughter and music, and the warmth of people who had watched this unlikely love story unfold with wonder. Even Mrs. Prescott was seen dabbing at her eyes during the toasts, while Harrington beamed with grandfatherly pride. 2 years later, on a golden September afternoon, Georgiana stood in the completed East Garden, one hand resting on her swollen belly while the other shaded her eyes from the sun. In the distance, she could see Philip riding across the estate with his steward, reviewing the autumn harvest preparations. Closer at hand, Louisa and Thomas played with their infant son on a blanket spread beneath an oak tree, their laughter carrying on the breeze. "Your Grace," Jane called from the terrace. "Mrs. Dalton asks if you have any special requests for tonight's dinner. Your father and Lord Thomas's family are expected by 6. Tell her whatever she prepares will be perfect," Georgiana replied. "She knows their preferences better than I do by now." She felt the baby kick strongly, a reminder of the new life that would arrive before winter. A son or daughter who would grow up knowing they were wanted, loved, the product of genuine affection rather than calculated arrangement. Philip appeared at her side, having returned from his ride. His hand joined hers on her belly, feeling their child's movements. "Active today?" "Very," Georgiana confirmed. "I think we have a future equestrian." "Or a gardener," Philip suggested, gesturing to the beautiful space surrounding them. "You have transformed these grounds into something my mother only dreamed of." "We transformed them," Georgiana corrected. "Together." Philip pulled her close, careful of her condition. "I love you, Georgiana, more than I ever thought possible to love anyone." "And I love you," she replied, resting her head against his shoulder. "Even though you trapped me in marriage through deception and nearly broke my heart through coldness." "Especially because of that," Philip said wryly. "It gave you the opportunity to demonstrate what a remarkable woman you are by conquering an impossible duke." Georgiana laughed, the sound full and joyous. "You were never impossible, just wounded and afraid." "As was I." They stood together in the garden, watching their family gather, feeling the life growing between them, and marveling at how something that began with contracts and desperation had transformed into the deepest love either had known. The contract that had bound them was long destroyed, torn apart by Georgiana's own hands, but the bond that replaced it was far stronger than any legal document could ever be. It was built on trust, earned through difficulty, on love proved through action, on commitment freely chosen rather than legally compelled. As evening fell over Winterbourne Hall and family gathered for dinner, Georgiana looked around the table at the faces of those she loved. Her father, finally at peace. Louisa and Thomas, building their own life together. Philip, her husband in every sense that truly mattered. And soon, their child, who would complete the circle. She had come to Winterbourne believing she was trading 1 year for her family's salvation. Instead, she had found her own salvation, discovered that love could bloom even in the most unlikely circumstances, and learned that sometimes the greatest happiness comes from choices we never planned to make. The Duchess of Winterbourne had been born from desperation and deception, but the woman Georgiana had become, the wife Philip had learned to love, the family they had built together, all of that was real and true and infinitely more valuable than any inheritance or title. And that, Georgiana thought as Philip's hand found hers beneath the table, was the only contract that truly mattered. Not the one written on paper and signed in haste, but the one written on their hearts and renewed with every passing day. A promise to choose each other, not once in a moment of necessity, but continuously, freely, forever.